At 6:58 a.m. on October 25, 1944, lookouts aboard USS Samuel B. Roberts broke the morning calm with an urgent report. 4 Japanese battleships were emerging on the horizon, 15 miles to the northwest, as the small destroyer escort patrolled off Samar Island in the Philippines. Roberts displaced just 1,745 tons. She carried 2 5-inch guns and a crew of 224 sailors, men who had been together for exactly 5 months and 27 days since the ship's commissioning. Ahead of them, at the head of the enemy formation, loomed Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. She displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 9 1-inch guns capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells more than 25 miles. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland lifted the intercom microphone and spoke calmly to his crew. A major Japanese fleet had been sighted. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, multiple destroyers, all of them steaming directly toward the American task group. Copeland did not soften the truth. This would be a fight against overwhelming odds. Survival could not be expected. Their task was simple: do as much damage as possible. The Japanese center force numbered 23 warships, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Nearly 200,000 tons of steel and firepower. Facing them were 6 American escort carriers built for anti-submarine warfare, protected by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. 7 small ships, barely 25,000 tons in total. The enemy outweighed them 8-1. Admiral William Halsey had taken every American battleship north during the night, chasing Japanese carriers. He left Task Unit 77, 4-3, Taffy 3, alone off Samar. Intelligence had reported the Japanese surface force retreating after the previous day's air attacks. They were not retreating. At 3 a.m., the Japanese fleet slipped undetected through San Bernardino Strait. Now they were closing at 30 knots. The American escort carriers could make no more than 18. They could not run from battleships. Up to that moment in the Pacific War, 53 destroyer escorts had been commissioned. Not one had ever engaged enemy battleships. Their doctrine was to guard convoys from submarines, not to charge capital ships. In the previous 3 months alone, Japanese naval forces had sunk 4 American escort carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In surface actions, only 40% of carrier crews survived. 1,200 sailors had already died. At 7:05 a.m., Admiral Clifton Sprague issued the order. Attack. 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, turned toward the enemy. 4 destroyer escorts followed. Samuel B. Roberts brought up the rear. They had only minutes before Japanese guns began firing. Below decks, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Lloyd Trowbridge heard Copeland's announcement echo through the ship. Navy regulations limited Roberts to 24 knots. Safety systems prevented the boilers from exceeding their designed limits. Trowbridge walked to the main control panel and began disabling every safety mechanism the Navy had installed. His crew watched in silence. No one objected. They all understood. 24 knots would not be enough. At 7:16 a.m., Johnston opened fire. Shells arced toward the Japanese fleet. The response was immediate. 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo crashed into the sea. Columns of water rose 200 feet into the air, swallowing the destroyer in smoke. At 7:23 a.m., Samuel B. Roberts turned directly toward the enemy. Flank speed, Copeland ordered. Trowbridge's modifications drove the ship to 28 knots, 4 knots beyond her design limit. The hull shuddered. Metal screamed. Steam pressure gauges surged deep into the red. No one cared. Speed was life. Ahead, the Japanese fleet stretched across 10 miles of ocean. At its center steamed Yamato, unchallenged, immense, and closing fast. On the Japanese right flank, the heavy cruiser Chikuma surged ahead of the battleships, 8 miles out in front. 2 miles behind her followed another cruiser, maintaining formation. To the left, Haguro and Chokai drove toward the American escort carriers, while destroyers spread out between the cruisers, forming a moving screen of steel and gunfire. For Samuel B. Roberts, the problem was brutally clear. She had to punch through that screen, close to torpedo range, fire, and somehow get out alive. Effective torpedo range was 5,000 yards, just under 3 miles. Roberts carried 3 Mark 15 torpedoes, capable of running that distance at 46 knots. But reaching 5,000 yards meant charging straight through a storm of shells fired by ships that could accurately hit targets 5 times farther away. The math offered no comfort. For every mile Roberts advanced, the Japanese could pour minutes of sustained fire onto her thin hull. At 7:32 a.m., the shelling began. 8-inch rounds from Chikuma splashed down around the destroyer escort. Green dye markers bloomed in the water, allowing Japanese spotters to correct their aim. One shell fell 50 yards off the port bow. Another landed 20 yards to starboard. Water columns rose higher than the ship's mast, crashing down in sheets. Copeland ordered hard left rudder, then hard right. Zigzag. Make the enemy work for every range correction. In the forward 5-inch gun mount, Lieutenant William Burton stood braced at his station. His crew had trained together for 6 months, firing thousands of practice rounds. None of them had ever fired at battleships. The gun could deliver 15 rounds per minute with a disciplined crew. Burton had a disciplined crew. What he did not have was unlimited ammunition. Roberts carried 608 rounds total, 304 per gun. At full rate of fire, that meant 20 minutes before the magazines ran dry. If he wasted shells now, the ship would be defenseless later. 10 men crowded the gun mount. Loader, rammer, powder man, fuse setter, trainer, pointer, gun captain, and 3 ammunition handlers. Their average age was 22. 2 had never been in combat before this morning. The others had fought submarines. Submarines did not answer back with 8-inch guns. At 7:38 a.m., Copeland's voice came over the intercom. They were closing for torpedo attack. Range to Chikuma, 7,000 yards. Still too far. They needed 2,000 yards more, 2 more minutes at 28 knots. 2 more minutes of shells falling around the ship. One direct hit from an 8-inch round would punch straight through Roberts' thin hull, explode inside, and kill everyone in its path. The forward gun mount was protected by 3/8 of an inch of steel, enough to stop shrapnel. Not enough to stop a cruiser shell. A direct hit would kill all 10 men instantly. At 7:40 a.m., Samuel B. Roberts crossed inside 5,000 yards. Torpedo range. Copeland gave the order. 3 Mark 15 torpedoes fired from the starboard side. White wakes streaked across the sea at 46 knots. Time to target, roughly 2 minutes. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal. Immediately, Copeland ordered a hard left turn, full speed away from the enemy. Disappear into the smoke before the Japanese could fix her position. Lookouts aboard Chikuma spotted the torpedo wakes almost at once. The cruiser swung hard to port. Emergency maneuver. Her rudder slammed over. 8,000 tons of steel heeled sharply as the ship turned. The first torpedo passed 50 yards ahead of the bow. The second slid past the stern. The third ran beneath the hull and failed to detonate. The Mark 15's contact exploder had a failure rate of nearly 40%. Roberts had just fired 3 duds. But Copeland had accomplished something more important than a hit. Chikuma had turned away from the carriers. Her attack run was broken. She was now steaming northwest, away from Taffy 3. 5 minutes lost. 5 minutes for the escort carriers to run south. 5 minutes closer to possible rescue from Admiral Halsey's distant fleet. At 7:45 a.m., Samuel B. Roberts emerged from her smoke screen. Chikuma had completed her turn and was swinging back toward the carriers, but now she was 8,000 yards away. Too far for another torpedo run. Copeland turned to his guns. Open fire. The forward 5-inch mount slewed toward the cruiser and elevated to maximum range. Burton fired. The first shell left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. 12 seconds of flight. It splashed 400 yards short. Burton adjusted. Second round, 200 yards short. Third, splashing near Chikuma's bow. Fourth, hit. The shell slammed into Chikuma's forward superstructure, punched through the plating, and detonated inside the ship. Smoke erupted from the impact point and rolled upward in thick, dark plumes. In the gun mount, Burton's crew fell into a relentless rhythm. Load. Ram. Fire. Load. Ram. Fire. 15 rounds per minute. The barrel heated rapidly. The recoil system slammed back and forth without pause. Spent brass piled up inside the mount, clanging against the deck with every shot. After 5 minutes of continuous fire, Burton had expended 75 rounds, only 5% of his total ammunition supply. He could see smoke and flashes on Chikuma, but he had no way of knowing how much damage had been done. The cruiser was still firing, still maneuvering, still driving toward the escort carriers. At 7:52 a.m., Chikuma shifted her attention. Her gun swung off the carriers and locked on a Samuel B. Roberts. 8-inch shells began crashing down closer, much closer. One exploded 30 yards off the port side. Shrapnel tore across the hull. Another detonated 20 yards to starboard, the blast wave slamming into the ship and shuddering through her frame. A third shell struck the water barely 10 yards off the bow. The splash drenched the forward gun mount. Seawater poured through the open gun ports and flooded the deck. It sloshed around the crew's boots as they kept firing. The mount was designed to operate wet. It had to be. Destroyers fought in storms and heavy seas. The crew had trained for flooding conditions. This was not training. This was the enemy Japanese finding the range. At 8:03 a.m., the destroyer Johnston took a catastrophic hit. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo struck her bridge directly. The blast killed her executive officer and badly wounded her captain. Johnston's speed fell to 17 knots. Steering control shifted aft. Even so, the destroyer continued firing. 3 miles to the north, Hull was locked in combat with the heavy cruiser Haguro. Hull had already been savaged. Her forward gun mount was gone. Her number 3 engine room was flooded. She limped along at 15 knots on a single engine. Samuel B. Roberts remained intact. She was still making 28 knots. She was still firing, but her ammunition was disappearing fast. After 18 minutes of uninterrupted fire, Burton had burned through 270 rounds from the forward gun, 90% of that mount's supply. 34 rounds remained. At the current rate, that gave him just over 2 minutes before the gun fell silent. At 8:07 a.m., Copeland gave a new order. Shift targets. The heavy cruiser Tone had closed to 7,000 yards, closer than Chikuma and far more dangerous. Tone carried 8 8-inch guns and was hammering the escort carrier Gamber Bay. Salvos were landing closer with every shot. Burton swung the mount to the new bearing. Elevated for range. Fired. The shell splashed short. Adjusted. Fired again. Hit. The round struck Tone's number 2 turret, punched through the armored face, and detonated inside. The turret froze. Its guns went silent. 1/4 of the cruiser's main battery had just been knocked out by a 5-inch shell. Firepower never meant to cripple a heavy cruiser. At 8:10 a.m., the forward gun aboard Samuel B. Roberts fired its final round. 304 shells expended. The barrel glowed a dull red from heat. The recoil system was failing. Springs had been driven beyond their limits. Oil smoked inside the recuperator. Burton and his crew had forced the gun past every specification the Navy had ever written. Now, there was nothing left to give. The forward mount fell silent. The forward gun mount was silent now. Its magazines were empty. Only the aft 5-inch gun remained in action. Gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr stood at its center. He was 20 years old, from Chakotah, Oklahoma. He had joined the Navy in May 1942, trained as a gunner at Great Lakes, and reported aboard Samuel B. Roberts 6 months earlier, in April. This was his first surface battle. His gun crew numbered 10 men, with an average age of 21. They had been firing almost non-stop since 7:45 a.m., 25 minutes of continuous action. 324 rounds had already been expended. 1 shell remained. At 8:15 a.m., Roberts' fragile margin of luck collapsed. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers had her trapped in a deadly triangle. Chikuma to the north, Tone to the northeast, Haguro to the northwest. They were closing fast. 6,000 yards. 5,000. 4,000. Roberts was running out of sea room, running out of smoke, running out of time, and she was about to take her first direct hit. At 8:20 a.m., an 8-inch shell from Chikuma struck amidships on the port side. The round punched cleanly through the thin hull plating, tore through the galley, and exited the starboard side without detonating, leaving a 3-foot-wide hole. Seawater flooded into the lower decks immediately. Damage control teams surged forward. Mattresses were shoved into the rupture. Shoring timbers braced buckled bulkheads. Even so, Roberts took on a 5-degree list to port. 2 minutes later, the next shell hit. This one detonated. The explosion ripped through the crew's berthing compartment, killing 6 sailors instantly. Steam lines ruptured, flooding passageways with superheated vapor. 4 more men were scalded badly. Speed dropped, 24 knots, then 20. One boiler went offline. Below decks, Trowbridge fought desperately to keep the remaining plan alive. At 8:25 a.m., the aft gun mount lost electrical power. The rotation motors stopped. The hydraulic ram froze. The firing circuit went dead. The mount was now entirely manual. Carr's crew had trained for this. Every destroyer escort crew had. Combat damage was expected. They knew the drill. Manual operation was slower, but it still worked. The trainer and pointer cranked the mount by hand. The loader and rammer heaved each 54-pound shell manually into the breech. The gun captain triggered the firing pin by hand. Rate of fire fell from 15 rounds per minute to 6, maybe 7 if they pushed hard. Carr's crew pushed hard. They kept firing. They cranked the mount toward tone, lifted a shell, rammed it home, fired. The recoil slammed backward with 8 tons of force. The deck plates flexed beneath their feet. Load again. Ram. Fire. 6 rounds per minute. The barrel glowed red-hot. Heat radiated through the mount. Inside, temperatures reached 130 degrees. The crew was drenched, sweat, seawater from near misses, steam from ruptured lines below. At 8:30 a.m., disaster struck the aft mount. A powder charge cooked off. Overheated metal ignited it spontaneously. The blast tore through the gun mount, killing 3 men instantly and wounding 7 more. Shrapnel shredded the interior. The explosion hurled Carr backward into a bulkhead. A jagged shard of steel ripped him open from neck to groin. He collapsed onto the deck. His intestines spilled out. He was dying. But Carr was not finished. He looked toward the ammunition rack. 1 shell remained, the final round in the magazine. He crawled toward it and pulled it against his chest. 54 pounds. He could not lift it alone. He could not stand. Blood poured from his wounds. He looked from the shell to the shattered breech. Then to his crew. They had to load it. They had to fire. They had to keep fighting. Machinist's mate second-class Chalmer Gohagen found Carr clutching the shell, pleading to have it loaded. Gohagen took the shell from his hands and tried to pull Carr away from the wrecked mount. Carr refused. He kept pointing at the breech, kept trying to make Gohagen understand. Load it. Fire it. Keep going. Gohagen set the shell down and dragged Carr away. The gun was finished. The breech was destroyed. The firing mechanism was gone. There was no way to fire that last round. Carr either did not understand or understood and no longer cared. He died 5 minutes later, still struggling to return to his gun. At 8:35 a.m., Samuel B. Roberts took another catastrophic hit. A 14-inch shell, fired by either Congo or Haruna, slammed into the starboard side. It penetrated the number 2 engine room and detonated inside. The explosion ripped a 40-foot-long, 10-foot-wide hole in the hull. Seawater flooded in. The engine room filled in 30 seconds. 8 men were killed instantly. Speed dropped to 10 knots. Then 5. Then 0. Roberts lay dead in the water. Copeland ordered the remaining crew topside. The ship was finished. Power was gone. Steering was lost. 3 feet of water filled the lower decks. Fires burned in 4 compartments. The stern sagged as the ship began to settle. At 8:45 a.m., more shells struck. 6-inch rounds from the light cruiser Noshiro. 8-inch shells from Haguro. Samuel B. Roberts was still under fire. The Japanese continued hammering the helpless destroyer escort. Each impact killed more men, maimed more bodies. Samuel B. Roberts had become a stationary target, unable to maneuver, unable to fight back. At 9:10 a.m., Copeland gave the order no commanding officer ever wanted to speak. Abandon ship. By then, 115 sailors were already dead or missing. The remaining 109 men began going over the side. Roberts carried 3 inflatable life rafts. 2 had been destroyed by shellfire. 1 remained, designed to hold 16 men. The wounded were placed into the raft. Everyone else entered the water. 3 floater nets drifted nearby. Men clung to them. Others grabbed whatever would keep them afloat: splintered wood, loose planks, empty shell casings, fragments torn from the ship. Some simply floated in their life jackets, exhausted, injured, stunned. At 9:35 a.m., Samuel B. Roberts rolled slowly to port. Her bow lifted clear of the water, rising toward the sky. The stern was already gone. For 10 seconds, she hung there, frozen, defiant, then slipped beneath the surface. Stern first, then the bow followed. 306 feet of warship vanished into the Philippine Sea. She sank in 600 fathoms, 3,600 feet, the deepest any American warship had ever been sunk in combat. 109 men remained in the water. Many were wounded, burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones. All were coated in fuel oil. Thick, black oil from ruptured tanks spread across the surface, covering skin, hair, faces. It burned eyes, filled mouths, invaded lungs. Some men retched uncontrollably. Others drifted unconscious. The water temperature was 84 degrees, warm enough to survive, at least for now. They had no food, no fresh water, no rescue in sight. The battle still raged around them. Japanese warships passed nearby. None slowed, none stopped. At 9:45 a.m., Admiral Takeo Kurita ordered the Japanese center force to withdraw. His cruisers had taken heavy punishment from American destroyers and aircraft. Chokai lay dead in the water. Shikuma burned fiercely. Suzuya's torpedoes had detonated after near misses. Kumano's bow had been blown away. 3 heavy cruisers were crippled. Kurita believed he had been fighting American fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. His staff insisted they were engaged with Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. They were wrong. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 were converted merchant hulls with flight decks. The destroyers were lightly built ships armed with 5-inch guns. But the confusion saved the invasion. The Japanese force turned north, retreating towards San Bernardino Strait. The battle off Samar was over. 3 American ships had been lost. Destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts. Destroyer Johnston. Destroyer Hull. The escort carrier Gamber Bay had capsized after taking fire from Yamato's 18-inch guns. 1,277 American sailors were dead or missing. Another 1,000 were wounded. But the invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf survived. MacArthur's troops kept landing. Supplies kept coming ashore. Japan's last real chance to stop the Philippine campaign was gone. In the water off Samar, 109 survivors from Samuel B. Roberts drifted. The sounds of battle faded northward, then vanished altogether. Silence settled over the sea. No engines. No gunfire. Only waves lapping against life jackets and floating debris. The men clustered around the single-life raft and the 2 floater nets. The wounded lay in the raft. Others clung to its edges, gripped the nets, or floated nearby. They were spread across a quarter-mile of ocean. Small clusters of 2, 5, 10 men, calling out to one another, trying not to drift apart. The fuel oil was the worst part. It coated skin and hair, clung to faces. Thick black crude from Roberts' ruptured tanks. When it got into eyes, it caused burning pain and temporary blindness. When it entered mouths, it triggered violent vomiting. Some men could not stop retching. They weakened hour by hour, dehydrated, exhausted. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose above 90 degrees. There was no shade, no water, no food. The wounded suffered terribly. Burns became infected within hours in the tropical heat. Open wounds were exposed to seawater, fuel oil, bacteria. Pain grew sharper as time passed. At 2 p.m. on October 25th, sharks arrived. Small ones at first, 6-foot blacktip reef sharks. They circled slowly, bumping into floating men, testing, investigating. One sailor removed his oil-soaked clothing, hoping to swim more easily. It was a fatal mistake. The pale skin caught a shark's attention. It nudged his leg, harder this time. The men in the water watched in terror as the sea around them began to change. The sailor panicked. He scrambled back onto the floater net, tearing his hands on the coarse rope as he pulled himself up. As the hours passed, larger shapes appeared beneath the surface. 8 feet, 10 feet. Tiger sharks. Bull sharks. They moved closer now, bolder, more deliberate. No one could say for certain that sharks took anyone. But during the first night, 2 men vanished. One moment they were there, the next gone. The others heard splashing, frantic movement in the water, then silence. No one wanted to give words to what that meant. Night brought cold, relative cold. The water temperature dropped to 78 degrees. It wasn't immediately lethal, But after 12 hours immersed, men began to shiver uncontrollably. For the wounded, it was worse. Their core temperatures fell. Hypothermia set in. By morning, 3 more had died, from shock, from injuries, from exposure. Their bodies were eased away from the raft and disappeared into the darkness. October 26th brought more sun and brutal heat. Dehydration became the greatest enemy. Some men began hallucinating. Ships on the horizon that weren't there, land that vanished when they blinked, rescue planes that never came. Others slipped in and out of consciousness, lips cracked and bleeding, tongues swollen. 5 more died on the second day. Their bodies drifted away, joining the others in the Philippine Sea. Copeland refused to let the rest give up. He kept the men talking, kept them responding, kept them awake. Sleep meant slipping under the surface. Sleep meant drowning. He organized the survivors into groups, appointed leaders, made them count off every hour. Anyone who didn't answer was shaken, spoken to, forced back into awareness. 14 men died over 3 days. 95 survived because Copeland would not let them surrender to exhaustion. At 7:45 a.m. on October 27th, a patrol craft finally spotted them. PC 1119 was escorting 5 landing craft infantry north of Samar when a lookout saw debris in the water. Then bodies. Then life jackets. The patrol craft approached cautiously. Japanese sailors were known to feign death and attack rescuers. The boat stopped 50 yards away. A voice called out, asking who had won the World Series. An answer came back immediately. St. Louis Cardinals. The patrol craft moved in. Rescue took 4 hours. 95 men were pulled from the water, some unable to stand, others unable to walk, many carried aboard by sheer effort. It had been 50 hours since Samuel B. Roberts went down. Every survivor was treated for dehydration, burns, infected wounds, and fuel oil poisoning. The worst cases were transferred to the hospital ship Comfort and sent to Hollandia. The others were moved to Leyte, then transported to San Francisco aboard the Lurline. They arrived on December 4th, 3 weeks before Christmas. The battle off Samar entered history as one of the greatest last stands ever fought at sea. 7 small American ships had turned back 23 Japanese warships. They saved an entire invasion fleet. They prevented a disaster that could have prolonged the war by months. Admiral Chester Nimitz called it the Navy's finest hour. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that no naval engagement had ever shown greater gallantry. Samuel B. Roberts received the Presidential Unit Citation. Robert Copeland was awarded the Navy Cross. Paul Carr received the Silver Star posthumously. In 1985, the Navy commissioned the guided missile frigate USS Carr, named for the gunner who died clutching his final shell. In 1982, USS Copeland was commissioned, honoring the captain who led his ship into impossible odds. In June 2022, explorer Victor Vescovo located Samuel B. Roberts resting 22,621 feet beneath the surface, over 4 miles down, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered, deeper even than Titanic. The wreck lies upright. The bow is separated from the stern by the impact, but the ship is unmistakable. The aft gun mount, where Paul Carr made his final stand, is still there, silent, waiting. The last survivor, Adolph L. Johnson, died on March 20th, 2022, at the age of 97, 3 months before the ship was found. That is the story of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, the small ship that charged Yamato, and the crew that refused to surrender, even when survival was never expected.